Hi friends, it's me, Em again, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things sinister. If you're interested in true crime or if you like anything horror related, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That way you can join me for some morbid conversation. So for today's chat, we're going to be combining both worlds, the world of true crime and the world of horror, and we're going to kind of do a murder media mashup, and that's because we're going to be talking about Charlie Howard. Now, Charlie Howard was a young man whose life, and especially whose death, affected Stephen King so much that he drew inspiration from him to base a character off of him in one of his best-selling novels. With that being said, if you haven't seen or read it, I suggest you hop off now because there are going to be a little bit of spoilers. We're going to go into the character in the book that Charlie Howard is based off of. So if you don't want that spoiled for you, just peace out until you read the book and then go read the book. Now, as you get to know me, you'll learn that on my bookshelf, Stephen King is quite literally king. He dominates my bookshelf. I am working my way through his entire collection right now, and he is hands down my favorite author of all time. So when I heard that there was a true crime that he actually utilized for inspiration for one of his stories, I had to look into it. And so that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to look into it together. Charlie Howard was 23 years old in 1984, and he was a transplant to Bangor, Maine. Despite it being a different time where homosexuality was closeted more often than not, Charlie never hid his sexuality. He was even known for occasionally wearing women's accessories, which at the time was definitely out of place. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. We are strictly talking about the era that he was in, that he grew up in. Obviously, in 2021, we're a lot more accepting now. That's not to say we don't have room to grow, but 2021 is a totally different world than 1984 was. And because of this, in 1984, despite the fact that Charlie was very proud of who he was very proud of being himself, this caused him to get a lot of harassment, as you can imagine. Both in school and then after he left school too. Unfortunately, it followed him throughout his whole life. He was constantly harassed for his sexuality, for the way he dressed, for the way he looked. Charlie had originally moved to Bangor and befriended Paul Nauden and Scott Hamilton, who saved him from being homeless by welcoming them into their home. However, when Charlie hadn't had much luck finding work, they encouraged him to move back in with his parents to get back on his feet, which he did. However, he wasn't living with them for very long before he decided to move back to Bangor. In fact, it would only be a few weeks before he would move back in with his two friends after being at his parents' house for just a short period of time. Once he moved back to Bangor, that's when his luck kind of turned around. He joined the Unitarian Church, which was very supportive of him. He joined a program called Interweave, which is a support group for the LGBTQ community. And he ended up getting his own apartment, moving out of his friend's place. And July 7th of that year, teenagers Sean Mabry, Jim Baines, and Daniel Ness would be out in Bangor after a night of drinking, looking for a way to continue their fun. What they found when they were out driving was Charlie Howard and Roy Ogden walking hand in hand. Their homophobia was fueled by their drinking, which caused them to pull over and harass the couple, leading to the point of things getting physical. Roy was able to get away, but Charlie suffered from asthma and he wasn't as quick as Roy was. The confrontation culminated with the teenagers picking up Charlie to throw him over the State Street Bridge into the Kenduskeag Canal. As they carried him to the bridge, Charlie begged them to stop and told them that he couldn't swim, but they chose to ignore that. Roy reported the incident immediately while the teenagers ran away. However, it wouldn't be until hours later that Charlie's body was found. The stress of the attack caused a severe asthma attack, which in turn caused Charlie to drown in just a shallow bit of water. The boys were arrested and sent to the Hancock County Jail, but they were released to their parents soon after. On October 1st, the boys were tried as juveniles and sentenced to the Maine Youth Centers for no longer than their 21st birthday. Originally, the teens were charged with murder, but after being out on bail, they were convicted of manslaughter and they served just an average of 2 years in prison, which to me is pretty pathetic. Now, King had just begun to write It at the time, and the story actually hit pretty close to home for him, quite literally, because he was living in Bangor when all this went down. And if you know anything about the book It or the movie it goes beyond just Pennywise being an evil clown that eats children. It's an infection. They call it the dairy disease, and it just horrible things spread throughout Derry. It goes into a lot of detail in that book, talking about things like the burning of the black spot, for instance. But it infects the whole town, and it just thrives on misery and death. And it's not just the death of children, which fuel him and feed him, but it's just the general misery of the town. So a lot of that goes on in Derry. A lot of horrible stuff happens in Derry, which is why King felt that this story, being as horrible as it was, what happened to Charlie, he could picture something like this happening in Derry because of the dairy disease. And so because of that, he wrote the character Adrian Mellon. Now, if you've read the book, or if you've seen the newer movie, Adrian Mellon wasn't featured in the TV miniseries, but he's featured in chapter 2 of the newer movie, then you can kind of start to see the parallels between Charlie Howard and the character Adrian Mellon. Adrian is a writer who winds up in Derry because he is writing a piece on the canal, and when he meets the character Don Haggerty, that's when he decides he wants to stay a little bit longer. And this is because the two men actually grow and develop quite a pretty serious relationship. And this relationship even gets to the point where Adrian moves in with Don at the beginning of their story. They move in after dating for some time. Now, Don hates Derry. He wants to go as soon as his lease is up. He wants to move from Derry, and he wants to take Adrian with him. On the other hand, Adrian loves Derry. He feels inspired while he's there. He pulled out a book that he's been working on for years, and this is the most progress he's made on it in quite some time. He's very happy to be there in Derry, but to make Don happy, he agrees to move when the lease is up. He agrees to move with Don. This is after Don showed him some horrible slurs and graffiti written on the bridge. So the two men end up going to the Derry Town Festival, and that's one of the places where King draws more parallels between the two cases, because Charlie Howard's case took place on the night of a festival, a celebration too. Now, as I've said, Adrian's not featured in the miniseries. He is featured in the movie, the newer movie, the second chapter, and it's a pretty graphic scene, pretty brutal. But if you've read the book, like I've read the book, I've done all three. I've seen both video adaptations as well as read the book. The scene in the book is absolutely brutal. King does not hold back on his descriptions. And it is one of the most stomach-churning scenes that I have ever personally read in a book. It's pretty graphic how they describe the physical altercation. Like Charlie was harassed by 3 teens, Adrian is likewise harassed by Webby Garden, Stephen Dubé, and Chris Unwin. In the book, there are actually 2 confrontations, the first one being pretty mild, with just some back and forth insults thrown before being broken up by an officer. It wasn't until leaving the Canal Days Festival that Adrian ran into the boys again and things got really uncomfortable. King is nothing if not graphic in his description, and the way he describes the boys assaulting Don and Adrian is stomach-churning. So the confrontation in the book and in the movie, as I'm sure you know if you are still here and not getting any spoilers, it culminates with the boys throwing Adrian over the bridge, just like Charlie Howard was thrown over the bridge. Now, one of the biggest changes that King made when he adapted the story into the book is instead of Adrian falling into the water and subsequently drowning, instead, when he meets the water, he also meets Pennywise, who then proceeds to pick him up, break his ribs, take a bite out of his armpit, and then take him to the sewers. And that's the end of Adrian Mellon. That's how he dies in the book. That's how he dies in the movie. He's not featured in the miniseries. Obviously, a little bit different death than Charlie Howard, but the means to getting to that death is the same, being tossed over the bridge by 3 teenage bullies for being gay, honestly. And that in itself is awful. They do eventually find Adrian, and he is found, and he is also buried in Derry. So I guess he kind of morbidly got his way. He didn't leave Derry. He stayed there like he wanted to stay there. So horrible way to do it, but he did it, I guess. Now, like I said before, King was very affected by the Charlie Howard case. It happened in his own little town, and it happened while he was living there, and it happened for horrible reasons. Essentially, this guy lost his life just for being gay, which murder should never be an excuse for somebody to lose their life. I don't mean it like that, but here's this, young guy who's just being himself, and because of him just being himself, he lost his life for just being who he was, which is awful. It's just awful. And so if you're like me and if you've read anything about the Charlie Howard case, the boys served on average 2 years in jail before they got out. And to me, that just doesn't feel like justice. Murdering somebody for something as simple as them just being themselves, for their sexuality, just seems awful. I don't feel like justice was served, and I don't think King felt that way either. Now, in the novels, it seems like Adrian gets more justice. There are 3 teens who are involved in that night. Chris was the youngest one, and he seems to be the one that is the most remorseful. He's also the only other one besides Don Haggerty who saw Pennywise that night. He helped the DA as far as convicting and getting a conviction for the other 2. And so because of all those things, not the Pennywise, but his age and his remorse and his helping out, he only got 6 months, which is a super light sentence. But the other 2, who were more of the instigators and the masterminds behind the issue, Webby served 10 years while Stephen was sentenced to 15 years. And that is a stark difference between that and the real life case. Because like I said, in the Charlie Howard case, on average, the teens served 2 years. So 10 and 15 years versus 2 years, it seems like Adrian got a little bit more justice in the novel than Charlie got in real life. Now back to Charlie. If there was anything you could say that was positive about such a stupid and senseless death, it really did accelerate the support for the LGBTQ community and for advocating for the rights and fair treatment of homosexuals. Marches and protests were done in Howard's honor, and still to this day there are marches to the bridge that he was thrown off of, where people throw flowers over to honor him. Even the aggressors have grown from the situation, and Baines himself would travel to high schools to give speeches on tolerance and testified before legislature to support a bill that would ban discrimination based on sexual orientation. Mabry says he thinks about Charlie's death daily and is tormented by his actions that resulted in Charlie's death. Also sparked from his death was the formation of the Maine Gay and Lesbian Political Alliance, which would later become Equality Maine, which is a political activist group that has pushed for anti-discrimination laws as well as fighting for marriage equality in Maine. I'll end this story with a quote by Stephen King when he was asked about the matter just a few years ago and kind of what he was feeling at the time. I think the death of Charlie Howard shocked people in the Bangor area out of their complacency about matters of sexual preference and prejudice. I know it did me. It's easy enough to see what happened as a stupid crime, a kind of felonious accident, fueled by booze, hazing that got out of hand. Probably too easy. In the aftermath of this inoffensive young man's death, the community underwent a period of self-examination that hasn't ended to this day. To me, that suggests one good thing that came out of Charlie Howard's death. But when I look back on it, I'm still overcome with the feelings of sadness and shame. I don't feel responsible exactly, and I'd never lay that on the community. But it's our town. We live here, which means we have to live with Charlie and continue trying to make it right. I think that's a great place to end. Obviously, on this channel, we talk a lot about death and murder and horrible, morbid, sinister situations. But this one just kind of struck me a little harder because I do advocate pretty hard in my personal life for equality and for being yourself and loving yourself who you are. And this poor guy was just being who he was, and because of that, there are such hateful people in the world that he lost his life because of it. And it's just a very, very unfortunate story with a very unfortunate ending. Anyway, guys, thank you for joining me today and chatting with me today. I hope it's been fun for you. It has definitely been fun for me. And until next time, I will see you later. Bye.